Somewhere around 5,000 years ago, a farmer in ancient Mesopotamia needed a new plow. He didn't have one, but his neighbor did. The neighbor didn't want anything the farmer was currently offering, and that was the problem that eventually changed everything. Nobody sat down one day and decided to invent money. Nobody drew up a plan. Nobody had a vision for what the global economy would eventually look like. Money wasn't invented, it evolved. Slowly, accidentally, and from something that had absolutely nothing to do with finance. It started with trade, specifically, the oldest and most obvious form of trade humans ever practiced. You give me something, I give you something back. This system is called barter, and for small communities where everyone knew everyone, it worked well enough. But barter has one fundamental problem that gets worse, the larger and more complex a society becomes. It requires what economists call a double coincidence of wants. You need to find someone who has exactly what you need and wants exactly what you have. At the same time, in a small village of 20 people, this is manageable. In a city of thousands, it becomes nearly impossible. So humans did what they always do when a system stops working. They found a workaround. The first workaround was commodity money, using objects that everyone already valued as a middle step between what you had and what you wanted. Grain was one of the earliest, not because anyone decided it should be valuable, but because everyone already needed it to survive. Cattle worked similarly in many cultures. Across vast stretches of ancient Africa, Europe, and Asia, how many cattle you owned was essentially how wealthy you were. The word capital itself comes from the Latin caput, meaning head, as in head of cattle. The most fundamental unit of ancient wealth wasn't a coin, it was an animal. But cattle had problems too. They died, they got sick, you couldn't easily split one in half to make change. Shells became one of the most widespread early solutions to this problem, specifically cowrie shells, which were small, durable, naturally uniform, and almost impossible to fake. Cowrie shells were used as currency across ancient China, India, Africa, and parts of the Americas across completely separate civilizations who arrived at the same solution independently. That independent convergence tells you something important. These shells weren't money because someone decided they were money because everyone agreed they were money. And that agreement is the entire foundation of every monetary system that has ever existed. But even shells had limits. They were geographically specific. A cowrie shell that was universally accepted in coastal West Africa meant almost nothing to a trader in the middle of Central Asia. What the ancient world needed was something small enough to carry in large quantities, durable enough to last generations, divisible enough to make change, and rare enough that anyone couldn't simply go collect more of it whenever they wanted. Metal was the answer, and around 5,000 years ago in ancient Mesopotamia, metal began replacing commodities as the dominant medium of exchange. Not as coins yet, just raw-weighed chunks of silver, copper, or gold measured out on simple balance scales each time a transaction happened. This worked, but it was slow. Every transaction required weighing, measuring, and trusting that the metal hadn't been mixed with cheaper materials to fake its value. The solution to this problem was one of the most significant inventions in all of human history, and it came from a small kingdom in western Turkey around 600 BC. The Kingdom of Lydia stamped a guaranteed weight and purity of metal directly onto small, standardized pieces, creating the world's first official coins. That stamp was the key breakthrough. It meant you no longer had to weigh and test every piece of metal yourself. The king's mark meant the king was vouching for it. And if the king was wrong or lying, you could march to the palace and complain about it. This created something the ancient world had never quite had before: institutional trust. Not trust between two individuals who knew each other, but trust in a system backed by an authority larger than any single person. The Greeks rapidly adopted and refined the Lydian innovation, minting their own coins across dozens of city-states, each with their own designs, weights, and backing authority. This multiplication of currencies immediately created a new problem and a new profession. Money changers had to figure out the relative value of dozens of different coins from dozens of different places, essentially inventing foreign exchange on the spot. The Romans took the concept further than anyone before them, creating the most standardized monetary system the ancient world had ever seen: coins minted to consistent weights and distributed across an empire stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia. The word salary comes from the Latin salarium payment made in salt, a reminder that even the Romans were operating in a world where the boundary between commodity money and coin money was still being negotiated. When Rome fell, the sophisticated monetary networks it had built largely collapsed with it. Trade contracted, local barter systems filled the gaps. Centuries of monetary progress reversed almost overnight in historical terms. But money didn't disappear, it adapted. And the next major evolution came not from Europe, but from Tang Dynasty China, roughly 8 centuries after Rome had fallen. Chinese merchants in the Tang and later Song dynasties were moving enormous quantities of goods across enormous distances. Carrying that much metal coin was heavy, dangerous, and impractical. So they developed something called a flying money, essentially a written certificate that said the person carrying this is owed X amount of coins, which they can collect at the other end of their journey. It worked! And the Song dynasty government, recognizing what had just been invented, formalized it into the world's first government-issued paper currency around 960 AD. When Marco Polo visited China in the 13th century and reported back to Europe that the Chinese emperor was paying for things with pieces of paper that everyone just accepted, Europeans thought he was insane. But the logic was identical to every monetary innovation that had come before it. The paper wasn't valuable because of what it was made of. It was valuable because everyone agreed it was valuable, backed by an authority everyone trusted. Europe arrived at paper money much later and through a completely different route through goldsmiths. In medieval Europe, wealthy merchants needed somewhere safe to store large quantities of gold and silver. Goldsmiths, who already had secure storage for their own materials, began offering to store other people's metal for a fee. In exchange for that deposit, the goldsmith gave the merchant a receipt, a written promise that said, in essence, "I have your gold, come and get it whenever you want." And then, and this is the moment everything changed, merchants started trading those receipts directly, instead of going back to collect the gold first. The goldsmith noticed something remarkable. Most people never came to collect all of their gold at the same time. At any given moment, most of the gold was just sitting in the vault doing nothing. So goldsmiths started doing something they were never explicitly authorized to do. They began issuing more receipts than they actually had gold to back, lending the excess out to borrowers and charging interest on it. This practice, lending out more than you actually hold in reserve, is called fractional reserve banking. And it is the exact same principle that underlies the entire modern banking system right now. The obvious risk was equally obvious to everyone involved. If too many people tried to collect their gold at the same time, there simply wasn't enough. This is a bank run, and it destroyed banks and economies repeatedly throughout history. Governments eventually stepped in to regulate what goldsmiths and later formal banks could do, creating the first central banking systems designed to prevent exactly this kind of collapse. By the 17th and 18th centuries, European governments were issuing official paper currency backed by gold reserves, a system called the gold standard, which meant every piece of paper money in circulation was theoretically exchangeable for a specific fixed amount of gold. The gold standard gave paper money its credibility, and for roughly 2 centuries, it anchored global trade in a way that allowed commerce to expand on a scale that would have been completely unimaginable to the Mesopotamian farmer who just needed a new plow. Then the 20th century happened. 2 world wars, massive government spending, and the practical impossibility of maintaining fixed gold ratios while also funding enormous modern military conflicts forced country after country to abandon the gold standard entirely. The United States was the last major economy to formally abandon it, which happened in 1971 when President Nixon suspended the dollar's convertibility to gold, an event now called the Nixon Shock. What replaced the gold standard is what we use today, fiat currency. Money that has value not because it's backed by any physical commodity, but purely because a government says it does, and everyone accepts that declaration. Which means, in the most technical sense, modern money works on exactly the same principle as a cowrie shell in ancient West Africa or a grain sack in ancient Mesopotamia. It's valuable because everyone agrees it's valuable, full stop. But the story doesn't stop with paper, because in the second half of the 20th century, money began doing something it had never quite done before it started dematerializing entirely. Credit cards arrived in the 1950s, electronic banking in the 1970s, online payments in the 1990s. Each step removed one more layer of physical material from what money actually was. And then in 2009, an anonymous person or group operating under the name Satoshi Nakamoto published a paper describing a system of money that required no government, no bank, no central authority of any kind, just mathematics and collective agreement: Bitcoin. Whether cryptocurrency eventually becomes a dominant form of money or remains a speculative asset is a question history hasn't answered yet. But its underlying logic value, created by collective agreement rather than physical backing, is the same logic humans have been operating on since the first cowrie shells changed hands in ancient West Africa. Looking back across this entire arc, from a Mesopotamian farmer who just needed a plow to digital currency running on decentralized networks, the story of money is really a story about one thing: trust at scale. Every single innovation in this story, from commodity barter to stamped coins, from goldsmith receipts to government paper, from credit cards to cryptocurrency, was a solution to the same recurring problem. How do you get two strangers to trust each other enough to trade? The Mesopotamian farmer solved it by trading grain everyone already needed. The Lydian king solved it by stamping his face on metal. The Chinese goldsmith solved it with a receipt. The modern government solves it by printing a number on paper and making it law. Each solution worked until it stopped working, and each time it stopped working, humans found a more abstract, more scalable, more trust-dependent replacement. The direction of travel across 5,000 years is unmistakable. Money has consistently moved toward being less physical, more abstract, and more dependent on collective belief. Which raises an uncomfortable question that economists and philosophers have debated for centuries. If money's value has always depended entirely on collective belief, was it ever really real in the first place? The answer, in the most practical sense, is yes, because something that builds cities, funds armies, feeds billions of people, and moves across continents in milliseconds is real in every way that matters, even if the thing itself is just an agreement. Nobody who stood in a Mesopotamian market weighing silver chunks on a balance scale could have imagined that the thing they were participating in would one day move at the speed of light across invisible networks connecting every human being on Earth. And yet the logic connecting those two moments is perfectly continuous. Unbroken across 5,000 years of civilizations rising and falling, currencies appearing and vanishing, empires printing their faces onto coins and then disappearing entirely while the coins outlasted them. The farmer who needed a plow and couldn't find anyone who wanted what he had to offer didn't know he was standing at the beginning of a 5,000-year chain of innovation that would reshape every aspect of human civilization. He just needed a plow, and the attempt to solve that one small, immediate, entirely practical problem is where all of this began. Money wasn't invented. It was discovered the same way every genuinely important human idea has always been discovered, not by someone looking for it. By someone trying to solve something much smaller and much simpler that was right in front of them. So here's what I want to know. If the entire global monetary system depends on collective belief, and enough people stopped believing in it at the same time, what actually happens? Tell me what you think in the comments.